Jack Bennett tightened his scarf as he walked through the frosty streets of Pine Haven. The town, wrapped in a blanket of twinkling lights and holiday cheer, was a picture-perfect postcard of Christmas magic. Children laughed as they slid down snow-covered hills, shopkeepers added the final touches to their festive displays, and the aroma of cinnamon and fresh pine filled the crisp air. Yet, for Jack, the season brought no comfort, only a dull ache that never seemed to fade. 5 years had passed since the accident that had taken his wife, Claire, and their young daughter, Sophie. On a night much like this, they had been heading home after a Christmas Eve gathering when icy roads and fate had conspired against them. Jack had survived, but the heart of his world had shattered, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. Now, his days were spent working as a carpenter, building furniture and mending things for the people of Pine Haven. His nights, however, were devoted to a ritual that had become his lifeline, granting wishes left on the town's Christmas tree. Every December, Pine Haven's residents would gather around the towering evergreen in the square, adorning it not only with lights and ornaments, but also with slips of paper carrying their heartfelt hopes and dreams. Most wishes were simple: warm coats for children, a new job, or reconciliation with a loved one. Jack made it his mission to anonymously fulfill as many as he could. That evening, as the snow began to fall, Jack approached the tree with a small wooden box in hand. He waited until the square was empty, then carefully collected the folded notes tucked among the branches. Back at his workshop, he sat by the fire and began reading through them. One by one, he set aside requests for toys, food, and assistance, mentally organizing his plans for the coming weeks. But one note stopped him cold. Scrawled in a child's uneven handwriting, it read, "Please bring my dad home for Christmas." The words struck a chord deep within him, stirring emotions he thought he had buried. He closed his eyes, trying to picture the face of the child who had written such a plea. The simplicity of the wish carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The following day, Jack found himself at the Cozy Corner Cafe, where much of the town gathered for coffee and conversation. The cafe was a warm refuge from the cold, with its checkered tablecloths, the hiss of a steaming espresso machine, and the hum of friendly chatter. Jack rarely lingered, preferring solitude, but he had come with a purpose. At a corner table, a young girl with curly brown hair sat with a notebook in front of her. Her mother, a weary but kind-looking woman, moved briskly between tables, refilling cups and taking orders. Jack recognized the girl instantly from the park, where he often saw her playing with other children. Emily, a cheerful voice called as the girl waved to a friend across the room. The name matched the image he had conjured while reading the note. It had to be her. Jack took a seat by the window, trying to appear casual as he observed. Emily's face lit up with curiosity and excitement as she showed her notebook to a nearby customer. The woman, who looked like she had seen better days herself, laughed at whatever Emily had said, the sound clear and genuine. Jack could see it. This child had a spark, a resilience he envied. "Can I get you something, Jack?" The voice startled him. He looked up to see the girl's mother standing by his table, notepad in hand. Her tone was polite but guarded, as if she had learned to tread carefully around people. "Coffee, black." "Thanks, Hannah," he replied, nodding slightly. Hannah Harper. He didn't know much about her, only that she had moved to Pine Haven a couple of years ago and was raising Emily on her own. Now, Jack pieced the story together. Her husband, Emily's father, had been a soldier. Rumors swirled that he had died in action, though no one spoke of it outright. When Hannah brought the coffee, Emily trailed behind, her curious eyes on Jack. "Do you believe in Christmas miracles?" she asked boldly. Jack blinked, caught off guard by her question. He hesitated, then said, "I'm not sure." "Do you?" Emily nodded, her face earnest. "Mom says miracles are just people being kind to each other. So, maybe you can help them happen." Jack felt a pang of guilt. The child didn't know the man sitting before her was already knee-deep in her story. But instead of responding, he simply smiled faintly and took a sip of his coffee. Later that night, as Jack walked back to his workshop, the weight of the little girl's wish hung heavily on his heart. He knew what he had to do, even if it terrified him. The promise he had made to himself, to remain in the shadows, to avoid connections that could reopen old wounds, was about to be tested. For the first time in years, Jack felt the faint stirrings of something he had long thought lost: hope. The following morning, Jack woke early, his mind still swirling with thoughts of Emily's wish. He had fulfilled countless requests over the years, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a plea for a toy or groceries. It was a cry from the heart of a little girl, a child clinging to the fragile belief that Christmas could bring her family back together. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he owed it to her to try. But where to begin? He had no concrete idea of what had happened to Emily's father, only whispers and assumptions. The town's rumors suggested he was missing in action, though that didn't always mean what people thought. Jack had seen enough veterans return home burdened by scars both visible and hidden, men who struggled to reintegrate into their old lives. If Emily's father was alive, there was a chance he hadn't come back for reasons only he understood. Jack decided his first step was to talk to people who might know more. He made his way to the Veterans Hall on the edge of town, a modest building with a faded American flag fluttering in the cold December wind. Inside, the scent of coffee and wood polish greeted him, along with the low hum of conversation among a handful of older men seated around a table. "Jack Bennett," one of them called out, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a quick smile. "What brings you here, son? Looking to join the club?" "Not quite, Charlie," Jack replied, pulling up a chair. "I'm looking for some information. Thought maybe someone here could help me." Charlie leaned back, folding his arms. "Depends on the kind of information. What's on your mind?" Jack hesitated. He wasn't used to asking for help, but something about Charlie's no-nonsense demeanor made him feel like this was the right place to start. "It's about Tom Harper, Emily's dad." The room fell quiet. A few of the men exchanged glances before Charlie spoke again. "Tom. Yeah, I remember him. Good kid. Served overseas a couple of years back. Came home, but, well, let's just say the war followed him." "What do you mean?" Jack pressed. Charlie sighed, his expression softening. He didn't talk much about it, but you could tell something wasn't right. Lost some buddies over there. After a while, he just disappeared. Didn't even say goodbye to his family. Some of us tried to reach out, but he wasn't answering to anyone. "Do you know where he went?" Jack asked, leaning forward. "I might," Charlie said after a pause. "Last I heard, he was working as a mechanic a couple towns over. Quiet place, off the radar. Guess he wanted to keep it that way." Jack felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. He thanked Charlie and the others, promising to stop by again soon, and left the hall with a renewed sense of purpose. The next day, Jack drove out to the neighboring town, following the directions Charlie had given him. The place was small, quieter even than Pine Haven, with a single main street lined with aging buildings. Jack parked his truck and approached a garage with a faded sign that read Tom's Auto Repair. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and grease. A man stood hunched over the hood of a car, his back to the entrance. He was tall, his broad shoulders suggesting a strength that hadn't faded despite the years. Jack cleared his throat, and the man turned. It was Tom Harper. The resemblance to Emily was striking. The same dark curls, the same piercing eyes. But Tom's face was lined with weariness, his expression guarded as he wiped his hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "My name's Jack Bennett," Jack began. "I'm from Pine Haven. I've been helping your family." Tom stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I don't have a family anymore." Jack stepped closer, undeterred. "That's not true. Your daughter, Emily, left a note on the town Christmas tree. She's wishing for you to come home. She misses you." "They both do." Tom's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, perhaps, or pain. But he shook his head. "You don't understand. They're better off without me." "Why would you think that?" Jack asked, his tone softening. "Emily doesn't feel that way. She believes in you. She's holding on to hope that you'll come back." Tom turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I can't go back. You think I don't want to? I've thought about it every day since I left, but I don't have it in me. I couldn't protect my men over there. What kind of father does that make me?" Jack took a deep breath. "A human one. Look, I know you've been through hell, But staying away isn't protecting Emily. It's hurting her. And it's hurting you, too. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of machinery. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you doing this? Why do you care? Jack hesitated, the weight of his own loss pressing against his chest. Because I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel like you've lost everything. But I also know that running doesn't make it better. If you go back, it won't be easy, but it'll be worth it. Emily needs you. And maybe you need her too. Tom's shoulders sagged as he let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can face them. You can, Jack said firmly. And you don't have to do it alone. Tom didn't respond, but the tension in his posture eased slightly. Jack took that as a sign of progress. He left the garage with no guarantees, but a sense that the door hadn't been completely shut. Back in Pine Haven, the days crept closer to Christmas, and Jack continued to spend time with Emily and Hannah. He helped decorate their modest home, stringing lights and hanging ornaments while Emily shared stories about her favorite Christmas memories. Hannah seemed lighter in his presence, though Jack could sense the weight she carried every day. As he prepared for the town's Christmas festival, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. Whether or not Tom found the courage to return, Jack knew he had done everything he could. Now, it was up to fate, and perhaps a little Christmas magic, to take care of the rest. The Christmas festival in Pine Haven was always the highlight of the year. As the evening approached, the town square transformed into a glowing winter wonderland. Strings of lights crisscrossed the streets, vendors set up booths selling hot cocoa and handmade crafts, and carolers dressed in festive scarves filled the air with warm harmonies. Snowflakes fell lazily, completing the picture-perfect scene. Jack stood near the towering Christmas tree, his breath visible in the cold night as he watched the townspeople gather. Emily and Hannah arrived hand in hand, Emily's face bright with excitement. She wore a red coat and a matching hat, her curls bouncing as she ran ahead to admire the tree. Jack couldn't help but smile. Over the past few weeks, Emily's unwavering belief in the magic of Christmas had brought light into his life, something he hadn't felt in years. Jack, Emily called out, waving to him. Did you see the tree? It's even prettier this year. I think you're right, Jack replied, crouching to her level. Did you help decorate it? Only a little, she said proudly. Mom says I have an eye for where the ornaments should go. She's not wrong, Jack said, his grin widening. Hannah joined them, her cheeks pink from the cold. She looked at Jack, her expression soft but searching, as if trying to understand the man who had so quietly become part of their lives. You've done so much for us, Jack, Hannah said, her voice quiet enough that Emily couldn't hear. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to, Jack replied, shaking his head. It's been a long time since I felt connected to anything. You and Emily have done more for me than you realize. Hannah opened her mouth to respond, but Emily tugged on Jack's sleeve. They're starting the carols. Can we go? Jack nodded, letting Emily lead the way. As the crowd gathered near the tree, Jack's heart felt heavier than usual. He scanned the faces around him, searching for someone who might not even show up. Tom had made no promises, and Jack knew better than to expect miracles. Yet, deep down, he couldn't help but hope. The mayor took the stage to welcome everyone, his cheerful voice amplified by a small speaker system. After a few words about the importance of community and togetherness, the carolers began to sing. Emily joined in, her sweet voice rising above the others as she sang Silent Night. Hannah stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder. Jack stayed on the edge of the crowd, keeping his distance. He didn't belong here, not really. This was their moment, not his. He watched as Emily's face glowed with joy, her eyes bright with belief that tonight, something magical would happen. The final carol ended, and the mayor announced the lighting of the tree. The crowd counted down together, and when the tree burst into a kaleidoscope of colors, a collective cheer erupted. Emily clapped her hands, turning to look for Jack. She spotted him and waved him over, but before he could move, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the square. Jack froze. Tom Harper stood there, his breath fogging in the cold air, his posture hesitant but determined. He wore a heavy jacket and boots dusted with snow, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Emily. For a moment, he didn't move, as if rooted in place by the weight of the moment. Jack's heart pounded. He wanted to step forward, to nudge Tom into action, but he held back. This was not his moment to orchestrate. It was up to Tom now. Emily turned and saw him. Her face lit up with recognition, and she gasped. "Dad!" The word cut through the noise of the festival, drawing the attention of those nearby. Hannah turned sharply, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Emily took off running, her small boots crunching through the snow. "Dad!" She cried again, her voice breaking. Tom dropped to his knees just as Emily reached him, and he caught her in his arms. His eyes were wet, his voice choked as he said, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." The crowd parted, giving the family space, and Jack felt his chest tighten. He saw Hannah approach cautiously, her expression a mix of shock and longing. When she reached them, Tom stood, still holding Emily, and looked at her with an apology written across his face. "Hannah," he began, but she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're here," she said simply. "That's all that matters." Tom pulled her into an embrace, and for the first time in years, the family was whole again. The onlookers began to clap, their cheers of encouragement filling the square. Jack watched from a distance, a lump forming in his throat. He had done what he set out to do, but the sight of their reunion left him feeling more empty than fulfilled. As the crowd dispersed, Jack turned to leave, thinking it was better to slip away quietly. But Emily spotted him. "Jack, wait," she called, breaking free from her father's arms and running to him. She threw her arms around his waist, squeezing tightly. "Thank you." Jack looked down at her, his vision blurring. "For what?" "For bringing my dad home," she said simply. Hannah and Tom approached, and for a moment, all four stood together. Tom extended a hand. "I don't know how to repay you," he said. "You don't need to," Jack replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Just be there for them. That's all they need." Tom nodded, his grip lingering as if he didn't want to let go. "You'll come by, won't you? For Christmas?" Jack hesitated, but Emily's hopeful face left him no room to refuse. "I'll be there," he promised. As he walked home that night, the snow falling softly around him, Jack felt something shift inside. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man on the outside looking in. He felt like a part of something, a family, a community, a future worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe in miracles. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a flurry of activity. Pine Haven bustled with last-minute shoppers, children pulling sleds through the snow, and the occasional burst of laughter as families built snowmen in their front yards. The air buzzed with the anticipation of the holiday, and Jack found himself pulled into the spirit of it in ways he hadn't expected. Emily was relentless in her excitement, constantly darting around her house to add finishing touches to decorations or rehearse carols she planned to sing on Christmas Eve. She'd taken to calling Jack her Christmas Angel, a title that made him chuckle, though he often felt unworthy of the name. Hannah, too, seemed lighter, her usual weariness replaced with a cautious but growing joy. She spent her time baking cookies, wrapping gifts, and preparing the small home for the first Christmas in years that felt truly whole. Tom had returned not just physically, but emotionally as well, making an effort to be present for his family in ways that surprised even him. For Jack, it was bittersweet. Watching the Harpers rebuild their bonds was heartwarming, but it also reminded him of the life he had lost. He often found himself stepping back, allowing the family to have their moments together, though Emily refused to let him stay on the sidelines for long. She dragged him into snowball fights, insisted he taste every batch of cookies, and even made him sit through a slightly off-key rendition of Jingle Bells on her recorder. "Jack, you're coming to dinner on Christmas, right?" Emily asked one afternoon as she arranged ornaments on the small tree in the corner of their living room. "I wouldn't miss it," Jack replied, leaning against the doorframe. "But don't expect me to sing." Emily giggled. "Maybe just one carol?" "Not a chance," Jack said with a grin, though he knew he'd probably given if she asked again. Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh blanket of snow, turning Pine Haven into a scene straight out of a holiday card. The church bells rang softly in the distance as the town gathered once more in the square for the final event of the season. Jack stood near the back of the crowd, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, watching his families huddled together in the cold. The Harpers arrived shortly after, with Emily running ahead to greet Jack. She wore a bright red scarf and mittens, her cheeks rosy from the chill. "You look ready to sing your heart out," Jack teased. "Maybe," she said with a mischievous smile. "But first, I have something for you." She pulled a small package from her pocket, wrapped in shiny paper and tied with a crooked bow. Jack blinked, surprised. "For me? Of course. Open it," Emily urged, bouncing on her toes. Jack carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a simple wooden ornament shaped like an angel. It was roughly carved, the edges uneven, but it was beautiful in its imperfection. He turned it over in his hand, touched by the gesture. "I made it myself," Emily said proudly. "Mom helped a little, but it was my idea." Jack cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Emily. It's perfect. Now you'll always have something to remember this Christmas," she said, her smile beaming. Jack nodded, tucking the ornament safely into his pocket. "I won't forget." The carols began shortly after, and as the familiar melodies filled the air, Jack found himself singing along softly, almost without realizing it. The warmth of the crowd, the glow of the tree, and the sound of Emily's laughter made the moment feel almost magical. After the event, the Harpers invited Jack back to their home for cocoa. The house was cozy and filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine. Emily proudly showed Jack the stockings she had hung by the fireplace, one for each family member, including him. "You didn't have to do that," Jack said, touched. "Of course I did," Emily replied. "You're part of our family now." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. For so long, he had kept himself apart, convinced that he didn't deserve to be part of something good. But Emily's earnest declaration chipped away at that belief, leaving him wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him here. Tom sat nearby, watching the exchange with a thoughtful expression. As Emily darted off to find more cookies, he leaned toward Jack. "She's right, you know," Tom said quietly. "You've done more for us than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me anything," Jack replied. Tom shook his head. "I do. You brought me back to them. You gave me the courage to face my demons. That's not something I can ever repay, but I want you to know how much it means to me." Jack didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, grateful for the sentiment, but still struggling to accept it fully. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Hannah sat down beside Jack on the couch. She held a mug of cocoa, her hands cradling it for warmth. "You've changed everything for us," she said softly. "I don't know how we would have gotten through this Christmas without you." Jack looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You would have found a way. You're stronger than you think." Hannah smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'm glad we didn't have to do it alone." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the crackle of the fire filling the room. Jack felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging that he hadn't allowed himself to believe was possible. As midnight approached, the snow began to fall again, blanketing the world outside in quiet stillness. Jack stood by the window, looking out at the peaceful street. He thought of Claire and Sophie, their laughter, their smiles, and for the first time, the memories didn't feel like a weight he couldn't bear. Instead, they felt like a part of him, something he could carry forward rather than leave behind. When Jack returned to his workshop later that night, he pulled out the angel ornament Emily had made for him. He placed it on the small tree he kept in the corner, the first decoration it had held in years. As he stood there, he realized that this Christmas wasn't just about bringing a family back together. It was about finding a way to let love back into his own life. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt at peace. He whispered a quiet thank you into the stillness, unsure if it was meant for Emily, the Harpers, or the loved ones he had lost. Maybe it was for all of them. Christmas morning dawned quietly in Pine Haven. The town was wrapped in a soft haze of snow, the kind that muffled sound and made everything feel slower, more deliberate. Jack woke early, as he often did, though this morning felt different. For years, Christmas had been just another day to endure. But this time, there was an unfamiliar sense of anticipation tugging at him. He stood at the window of his small cabin, looking out at the woods that surrounded his property. The snow was pristine, untouched except for the faint tracks of animals. On the sill nearby rested the angel ornament Emily had made, its rough edges catching the morning light. Jack picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made it all the more special. For a moment, he considered staying home, letting the Harpers have their day without him. But then he thought of Emily's face when she'd called him part of their family, her unshakable belief that he belonged with them. That belief had been enough to pull him out of the shadows he'd hidden in for so long. Staying home would feel like a betrayal, not just to Emily, but to himself. He got dressed, pulling on his warmest sweater and boots, and packed a small gift he had made for Emily. It wasn't much, just a wooden music box carved with a winter scene, but he'd spent hours perfecting it, hoping it would bring her the same joy she had given him. By the time he arrived at the Harpers' house, the sun had climbed higher, making the snow glitter like diamonds. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and Jack could hear faint laughter from inside. He hesitated for a moment before knocking, unsure why he still felt so nervous around them. But before he could second-guess himself, the door flew open. "Jack!" Emily's voice rang out, full of delight. She grabbed his hand and pulled him inside, barely giving him a chance to take off his coat. "You're just in time. We haven't even opened presents yet." The warmth of the house enveloped him, both physically and emotionally. The living room was a cozy whirlwind of holiday cheer. The tree stood proudly in the corner, its branches heavy with ornaments, and stockings hung from the mantel above the crackling fire. Tom sat on the floor beside the tree, looking more at ease than Jack had ever seen him. Hannah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, her smile lighting up the room. "Merry Christmas, Jack," she said, her voice soft but welcoming. "Merry Christmas," Jack replied, feeling a little overwhelmed by the sheer normalcy of it all. It was the kind of scene he'd avoided for years, afraid it would hurt too much to be reminded of what he'd lost. But now, standing here, it didn't feel painful. It felt right. "Come on," Emily urged, tugging him toward the couch. "You have to sit by me while we open presents." Jack couldn't help but laugh as he let her guide him. He settled into the spot she indicated, her excitement infectious. The family began passing out gifts, the room filling with the sounds of paper tearing and laughter as each package revealed something thoughtful and heartfelt. When it was Emily's turn to open Jack's gift, she took her time, carefully untying the ribbon as if savoring the moment. When she lifted the lid of the music box and the delicate melody began to play, her eyes widened with awe. "It's beautiful," she exclaimed, tracing her fingers over the carved scene. "You made this?" Jack nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I thought you might like it." "Like it? I love it." Emily threw her arms around him in a hug that was far bigger than her small frame seemed capable of. "Thank you, Jack." Tom and Hannah exchanged a glance, their expressions full of gratitude. Jack caught it and felt a rush of emotion he couldn't quite put into words. This was what he had been missing. Not just the warmth of a family, but the sense of being needed, of having a place where he belonged. As the morning turned into afternoon, the family invited Jack to stay for dinner. He helped set the table, laughing as Emily directed everyone with the authority of a seasoned event planner. The meal was simple but perfect, the kind of food that felt like home. They talked and shared stories, Tom opening up about his time away and how difficult it had been to face his own fears. It was a conversation filled with honesty and forgiveness, and Jack marveled at how far they had come in such a short time. After dinner, they gathered in the living room again, the fire casting a warm glow across the space. Emily sat on the floor, playing with the music box, while Tom and Hannah shared the couch, their hands intertwined. Jack sat in his usual spot by the window, watching the scene unfold with quiet contentment. Hannah looked over at him after a while, her expression thoughtful. "Jack," she said, her voice cutting through the soft hum of the room, "thank you. Not just for today, but for everything. You've given us so much more than we could ever repay." Jack shook his head, his throat tight. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "If anything, I should be thanking you. You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again." "What's that?" Hannah asked gently. "A reason to believe," Jack replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of his words settling over them. Then Emily broke the silence, climbing onto the couch to sit beside him. "Jack," she said, resting her head on his shoulder, "I'm glad you're here." Jack wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. For years, he had believed he was too broken to let anyone in, too haunted by his past to find peace. But now, surrounded by this family, he realized that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about finding the courage to embrace the love that was still waiting. As the snow continued to fall outside, Jack felt something shift deep within him. A quiet but undeniable certainty that this Christmas wasn't just a moment in time. It was a beginning, a chance to step out of the shadows and into a life filled with hope, connection, and purpose. For the first time in years, Jack felt whole, and he knew that wherever the future led, he would never face it alone. As the holiday season wound down and the glow of Christmas began to fade, life in Pine Haven resumed its usual rhythm. The snowplows cleared the streets, children returned to school, and shopkeepers replaced their festive displays with signs announcing post-holiday sales. Yet, for Jack, something had shifted irreversibly. The days following Christmas felt different. The heavy loneliness that had clung to him for years seemed lighter now, as if it had been replaced by something warmer, more hopeful. He found himself smiling more often, not out of obligation or politeness, but because there was finally something to smile about. And more than that, he began to feel a sense of belonging, a connection to the people around him that he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Emily was a constant presence in his life, her boundless energy and enthusiasm pulling him out of his quiet routines. She'd stop by his workshop after school, her backpack slung over one shoulder, to see what he was working on or to show him something she'd drawn. Sometimes she brought cookies or bits of leftover pie from Hannah, who always sent her with a reminder to thank Jack for everything he'd done. One chilly afternoon, Emily showed up with a determined look on her face. Jack looked up from the table he was sanding, already amused by the spark in her eyes. "What's on your mind?" he asked, leaning on the edge of his workbench. "I think we should make something together," she announced, setting her backpack on the floor. "Something really special." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" "A new sign for Mom's Cafe," Emily said, her grin widening. "The one she has now is all old and faded. It's kind of boring. Don't you think she'd love a new one?" Jack smiled, nodding slowly. "I think that's a great idea, but we'll have to make sure it's a surprise." Emily clapped her hands excitedly. "I'm really good at keeping secrets. When can we start?" They spent the next week working on the sign in secret, brainstorming ideas and sketching designs during Emily's visits. She insisted on painting it herself, carefully selecting bright, cheerful colors that reminded her of the cafe's cozy interior. Jack helped guide her hand when the details got tricky, marveling at her determination and creativity. By the time they finished, the sign was a work of art, its hand-painted letters and whimsical design capturing the spirit of the cafe perfectly. On the day they planned to surprise Hannah, Jack loaded the sign into the back of his truck while Emily danced around in excitement. When they arrived at the cafe, Hannah was behind the counter, wiping down tables and chatting with a customer. She looked up as they entered, her expression shifting to curiosity as Emily tugged Jack toward the door. "Close your eyes, Mom," Emily called, her voice bubbling with excitement. Hannah laughed, raising an eyebrow. "Why? What are you two up to?" "Just trust me," Emily said, rushing to cover her mother's eyes with her hands. Jack positioned the sign just outside the front window, angling it so it could be seen from inside. He stepped back, admiring their handiwork one last time before nodding to Emily. "Okay, open them," Emily exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. Hannah gasped as she took in the sign, her hand flying to her mouth. The words Cozy Corner Cafe were painted in bold, inviting letters, surrounded by small illustrations of steaming coffee cups and snowflakes. Beneath the name, a smaller line read, where everyone feels at home. Tears filled Hannah's eyes as she turned to Jack and Emily. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Jack said, smiling softly. "Emily did most of the work. I just helped a little." Hannah pulled her daughter into a hug, then turned to Jack. "You've done so much for us." "For me? How do I even begin to thank you?" Jack shook his head. "You already have." As the cafe's customers gathered to admire the new sign, Hannah placed a hand on Jack's arm, holding him back for a moment. "You've become part of our family, Jack," she said quietly. "You've given us so much more than this sign. You've given us hope." Jack nodded, his throat tightening. "You've given me just as much," he said. "Maybe more." In the weeks that followed, Jack's life continued to intertwine with the Harpers. He found himself looking forward to their visits, their laughter, and the warmth they brought into his world. He joined them for dinners, helped Emily with her school projects, and even began to open up to Tom, sharing bits and pieces of his own story. One evening, as they sat around the table after a hearty meal, Tom surprised Jack with a question that caught him off guard. "Have you ever thought about what's next for you, Jack?" Tom asked, his tone thoughtful. "Now that you're part of all this?" Jack hesitated, unsure how to respond. For so long, he hadn't let himself think about the future. It was easier to focus on the present, on the small ways he could help others, rather than face the unknown. "I don't know," Jack admitted. "For a long time, I didn't think there was anything next for me. But now, I guess I'm starting to believe there might be." Tom nodded, his expression understanding. "You've got a good heart, Jack. Whatever comes next, I hope you know you're not alone anymore." Jack looked around the table, at Emily's bright smile, at Hannah's quiet strength, and at Tom's steady presence. For the first time in years, he felt like he could see a future beyond his grief, one built on connection and purpose. Whatever lay ahead, Jack knew he was ready to face it, and he knew he wouldn't have to face it alone. Winter in Pine Haven lingered, the snowbanks growing higher with each passing storm, but the chill in the air seemed to bother Jack less these days. Life had taken on a rhythm that felt almost normal. Visits to the Harpers, afternoons spent in his workshop, and quiet evenings when he could sit by the fire and reflect on how much had changed. Emily's visits remained a highlight of his days. She was a bundle of energy and ideas, constantly bringing scraps of paper covered in sketches for projects she thought they should build together. One snowy afternoon, she bounded into the workshop, shaking off her boots and holding up a crumpled piece of notebook paper. "Jack, I have the best idea," she announced, her breath fogging the cold air. Jack looked up from the chair he was repairing, setting his tools aside. "Let's hear it. We should make a sled. A big one. Big enough for me and Dad to ride together. He said he used to love sledding when he was my age, but we don't have a good sled at home." Jack chuckled, leaning back against the workbench. "That's ambitious, but I think we can manage it. Got a design in mind?" Emily's eyes lit up. "I drew one." She unfolded her paper and laid it on the table, pointing to a rough sketch of a sled with intricate carvings along the sides. "See? It should look like it belongs in a Christmas movie." Jack studied the sketch, nodding thoughtfully. "I think we can make this work. It'll take some time, though." Emily grinned. "I don't mind. I'll help with whatever you need." True to her word, Emily showed up every day after school, eager to work on the sled. Jack let her sand the wood, paint the carvings, and even hammer a few nails under his careful supervision. They worked together in comfortable silence, broken only by her chatter about school or the books she'd been reading. As the sled took shape, Jack couldn't help but marvel at how much joy Emily brought into his life. She had a way of pulling him out of his head, of making him see the world through her hopeful, unfiltered perspective. He found himself looking forward to her visits, not just for the company, but for the way they reminded him of what it felt like to care about something again. When the sled was finally finished, Jack stepped back to admire their handiwork. The wood gleamed with fresh varnish, the carvings along the sides painted in festive red and green. Emily clapped her hands in delight, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "It's perfect," she declared. "Dad's going to love it." Jack smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "Let's take it for a test run before we show him." Make sure it's up to your standards. They hauled the sled to the hill behind the workshop, where the snow lay untouched and glistening in the afternoon sun. Jack held the sled steady while Emily climbed on, her cheeks pink with excitement. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she shouted. Jack gave the sled a gentle push, watching as it glided smoothly down the hill. Emily's laughter rang out, clear and bright, as she sped to the bottom. When the sled came to a stop, she turned and waved at him, her face glowing with joy. "You have to try it," she called. "It's so much fun." Jack hesitated for a moment before making his way down the hill. Emily insisted he sit in front while she climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Hold on tight," she warned, and with a whoop of delight, they launched down the hill together. The rush of cold air and the thrill of the ride brought a rare, unguarded laugh from Jack. For a few brief moments, he felt like a kid again, the weight of the past lifted by the simple joy of the moment. When they reached the bottom, Emily was grinning from ear to ear. "See? I told you it was fun," she said, hopping off the sled. Jack nodded, still catching his breath. "You were right. It's a good sled." They spent the rest of the afternoon taking turns riding the sled and trudging back up the hill, the world around them filled with the sound of their laughter. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they were both breathless and exhausted. When they returned to the Harper's house, Emily couldn't contain her excitement. She burst through the door, dragging the sled behind her. "Dad, look what Jack and I made," she exclaimed. Tom looked up from the couch, his eyes widening as he took in the sled. "Wow," he said, standing to get a closer look. "This is incredible. You two did this together?" "Yep," Emily said proudly. "And it works perfectly. We tested it on the hill." Tom ran a hand over the sled's smooth surface, his expression softening. "This is amazing, Emily. Thank you." "It was Jack's idea too," Emily added, glancing back at him. Tom turned to Jack, a grateful smile on his face. "I don't know how you keep finding ways to make this Christmas better, but thank you for everything." Jack shrugged, feeling a little awkward under the praise. It was mostly Emily. She's got the vision. As the evening went on, the sled became the centerpiece of conversation, with Emily eagerly recounting every detail of its construction. Jack listened quietly, content to let her take the spotlight. Watching the way Tom and Hannah beamed at her, he felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond the sled itself. This wasn't just about building something useful or beautiful. It was about creating moments, memories that would carry this family forward. And in doing so, Jack realized he was creating something for himself as well, a life filled with purpose, connection, and a kind of happiness he'd thought was lost forever. As January settled in, Pine Haven began to shed its holiday sparkle. The decorations came down, the festive lights were packed away, and the town returned to its quiet, snow-blanketed existence. The bustle of Christmas had faded, but the sense of connection Jack had found with the Harpers remained. It was as if the season's magic had left behind an enduring warmth, one that carried them all through the cold, gray days of winter. Jack continued to spend his time between his workshop and the Harpers' home, now a regular fixture in their lives. He shared dinners with them more often than not, sometimes staying late into the evening, talking with Tom or helping Emily with her schoolwork. It was a routine that felt natural, though it still caught Jack by surprise how much he looked forward to those moments. One snowy evening, as the fire crackled in the Harper living room, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through an old photo album she'd pulled from a shelf. Jack sat nearby, carving a small wooden bird for a project he'd started, while Hannah sipped tea and Tom rested with his feet propped up on an ottoman. "Jack," Emily said suddenly, her voice tinged with curiosity, "do you have any pictures of when you were little?" Jack glanced up from his carving, caught off guard by the question. "Not many," he admitted. "I wasn't much for pictures even when I was younger." "Did you make things back then too?" Emily asked, her bright eyes fixed on him. Jack smiled faintly. "I did. My dad taught me how to use tools when I was about your age. We used to build birdhouses together." Emily nodded thoughtfully, then tilted her head. "Do you ever miss him?" The question hit Jack with a surprising force, but he didn't let it show. Yeah, I do, he said simply. He passed a long time ago, but I still think about him. Hannah glanced at him from her spot on the couch, her gaze soft but unreadable. Jack returned to his carving, using the repetitive motions to ground himself, but Emily's question lingered. He rarely spoke about his past, and even now, with this family that had become so dear to him, it wasn't easy. Yet he found comfort in the way they listened, without judgment or expectation, just quiet acceptance. A few days later, Jack found himself back at his workshop, preparing for a new project. The sled he and Emily had built still sat near the door, a reminder of their shared efforts and the joy it had brought. He ran his fingers over the smooth wood, thinking about how something so simple had become so meaningful. The sound of footsteps crunching through the snow pulled Jack from his thoughts. He looked up to see Tom approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. Jack opened the door, letting in a gust of cold air as Tom stepped inside. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Tom said, shaking off the snow. "Not at all," Jack replied, gesturing to a stool near the workbench. "What brings you by?" Tom sat down, looking around the workshop with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "This place suits you," he said. "It's like everything here has a story." Jack chuckled, leaning against the bench. "Some of it does. Other pieces are just waiting for the right project." Tom nodded, then hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said finally. "About Emily and Hannah." Jack tensed slightly, unsure where the conversation was headed, but he nodded for Tom to continue. "You've been a big part of our lives these past few months," Tom said. "More than I think you even realize. Emily adores you. Hannah, well, she smiles more when you're around. And I can't tell you how much it's meant to me, having you there to help me figure all this out." Jack shifted, unaccustomed to such direct praise. "You don't have to thank me for that," he said. "You've done the hard part. Showing up, staying." "Maybe," Tom said, his tone thoughtful. "But you've given us something I couldn't. Stability. A sense of safety. I don't know how to explain it, but when you're around, it feels like things are going to be okay." Jack didn't know how to respond. He'd spent so long thinking of himself as someone who lived on the fringes, offering help but never staying long enough to truly belong. Yet here was Tom, telling him he was part of the fabric of their lives in a way Jack hadn't thought possible. "I don't know what to say," Jack admitted after a moment. Tom smiled. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know how much we appreciate you. And I hope you'll stick around. For good." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jack felt something stir deep within him, a mixture of fear and hope, the tug of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. He thought of Emily's laughter, Hannah's quiet strength, the way their home felt alive with warmth and love. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of staying, of building something lasting. "I'll do my best," Jack said finally, his voice steady. "That's all I can promise." Tom nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. They talked for a while longer, their conversation drifting to lighter topics, but Jack couldn't shake the weight of what had been said. As Tom left, Jack stood at the doorway, watching him disappear into the snowy evening. Back inside, Jack returned to his workbench, his mind racing. He picked up the wooden bird he'd been carving, running his thumb along its delicate wings. It wasn't finished yet, but he could see what it would become. Maybe, he thought, the same could be said for his own life. The quiet of the workshop felt different now, not lonely, but full of possibility. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to believe that he might truly have a place in the world he was helping to create. As winter stretched on, Jack found himself more deeply entrenched in the life of Pine Haven than he ever thought possible. The Harpers had become his anchor, pulling him further from the solitary existence he had embraced after the loss of his wife and daughter. Each passing day, he found it harder to imagine a life without their warmth and presence. Emily was a constant flurry of energy, her joy infectious even on the coldest days. She'd often show up at his workshop, her cheeks flushed from the chill, ready with a new idea or a story from school. She'd chatter away while Jack worked, her laughter filling the space that had once been so quiet and still. One particular afternoon, Emily came bursting through the door, holding something tightly in her mittened hands. "Jack, you have to see this," she exclaimed, her voice breathless with excitement. Jack looked up from the cabinet he was repairing, smiling at her enthusiasm. "What's got you so worked up?" She handed him a small, faded photograph. In it, a much younger Tom stood next to a sled that looked strikingly familiar. "Dad found this in an old box," Emily explained. "It's the sled he used to have when he was my age. Doesn't it look just like the one we made?" Jack studied the photograph, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The resemblance was uncanny. "It does," he said. "I guess you inherited your dad's good taste." Emily beamed. "I want to surprise him. Can we take the sled out tomorrow and set it up just like this picture? I'll get him to come outside, and we'll recreate it." Jack nodded, already picturing the scene. "I think that's a great idea. Let's do it." The next morning, the two of them worked quietly, hauling the sled to the park where the snow lay undisturbed. They arranged it near a tree that looked similar to the one in the photograph, carefully matching the angle and position. Emily even wore a scarf she insisted looked just like the one her dad had in the picture. When everything was ready, Jack stood back and admired their handiwork. "Perfect," he said. "Now we just need to get your dad out here." Emily grinned mischievously. "Leave that to me." She raced back to the house, leaving Jack to wait by the sled. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bit at your nose but left the world feeling clean and bright. Jack watched his breath curl in the air, his mind drifting to thoughts of how much had changed since Christmas. He wasn't just a visitor in the Harpers' lives anymore. He was part of them, as much as he tried to resist the pull. When Tom appeared at the edge of the park, following Emily's insistent tugging, his expression shifted from confusion to surprise. He stopped in his tracks, staring at the sled and the familiar scene before him. "What's this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "It's for you, Dad," Emily said, her eyes sparkling. "Do you like it?" Tom walked slowly to the sled, running a hand along its smooth surface. "It's incredible," he said softly. "You really outdid yourself, kiddo." "Jack helped," Emily said, glancing at him. "We wanted to make it special for you." Tom turned to Jack, his gratitude evident even before he spoke. "You've done more than I can ever thank you for, Jack. This means a lot." Jack shrugged, feeling a familiar awkwardness rise in his chest. "It was all Emily's idea. I just helped bring it to life." Tom looked at the sled again, his gaze distant. "This brings back a lot of memories," he said. "Good ones. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have moments like this." "Well, now you can make new ones," Emily said, grabbing his hand. "Come on, let's try it out." The three of them spent the rest of the morning sledding down the hill, their laughter echoing through the park. Jack couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so carefree, so completely present in a moment. Watching Emily and Tom race each other down the hill, he felt a deep sense of contentment that was as unfamiliar as it was welcome. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, they packed up the sled and headed back to the Harpers' house. Inside, Hannah had hot cocoa waiting, the warmth of the house wrapping around them like a blanket. "Looks like you all had fun," Hannah said, handing Jack a mug. "We did," Jack replied, his hands curling around the warm ceramic. "Emily's got a knack for turning an ordinary day into something special." Hannah smiled, her gaze lingering on him. "She gets that from you, you know." Jack looked down at his cocoa, unsure how to respond. He still struggled to see himself the way the Harpers seemed to, as someone who brought light into their lives. But moments like this made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could start to believe it. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and Emily fell asleep curled up on the couch, Tom and Hannah sat quietly, their hands intertwined. Jack watched them from his spot by the window, his heart full but heavy with a question that had been building for weeks. "Why me?" he asked finally, his voice low. "Why did you let me in?" Hannah looked at him, her expression soft and unwavering. "Because you needed us as much as we needed you," she said simply. "And because sometimes, the best families are the ones we choose." Jack nodded, her words settling over him like the snow outside, quiet, gentle, and undeniable. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. He wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The final stretch of winter in Pine Haven came with the promise of spring just on the horizon. The snow, though still thick, began to soften, and the days grew longer. Life moved forward, as it always did. But this time, Jack didn't feel like he was simply drifting through it. He had a purpose now, a place to belong, and people who cared for him in ways he never thought he'd experience again. One afternoon, as Jack worked in his shop, the door creaked open and Hannah stepped inside. She brushed the snow from her coat and glanced around, her gaze settling on Jack as he stood over his workbench. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice warm. "Not at all," Jack replied, setting down the piece of wood he'd been carving. "What brings you by?" Hannah hesitated, her hands fiddling with the strap of her purse. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she said, stepping closer. "It's been on my mind for a while now." Jack leaned against the bench, crossing his arms. "Sounds serious." "It is," she admitted. "But it's also good." She paused, searching for the right words. "Jack, you've been such an important part of our lives these past months. You've done so much for Emily, for Tom, for all of us. And I want to make sure you know how much that means to us." Jack shifted uncomfortably, not used to being the focus of such gratitude. "I didn't do anything special," he said, looking down. "I just tried to help." Hannah smiled, her eyes kind. "That's exactly what makes it special. You gave us hope when we didn't have much left. You helped Tom find his way back to us. And you've been there for Emily in ways I can't even begin to explain." Jack met her gaze, his throat tightening. "You didn't have to come all the way here to tell me that," he said softly. "I did," Hannah insisted, "because I need you to know that you're not just someone who came into our lives by chance. You're part of our family now, Jack, and we're not letting you go." Jack felt the weight of her words settle over him, not heavy but grounding, like an anchor. He'd spent so long convincing himself that he was better off alone, that his grief was something he had to bear in solitude. But Hannah's words chipped away at that belief, leaving behind a quiet, fragile hope. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice rough. "You don't have to say anything," Hannah said, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. "Just know that you're not alone. Not anymore." The silence that followed wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, a shared acknowledgement of how far they had all come. Later that evening, Jack joined the Harpers for dinner. Emily had insisted he stay, as she often did, and he didn't have the heart to refuse. The meal was simple, hearty stew and freshly baked bread, but the atmosphere was lively. Emily chattered excitedly about her latest art project, Tom shared a story from his time working at the garage, and Hannah chimed in with laughter and warmth that filled the room. As the meal wound down, Emily suddenly jumped up from her chair. "I almost forgot," she exclaimed, running to the other room. Hannah smiled, shaking her head. "I never know what that girl is up to." Emily returned moments later, holding a small box wrapped in colorful paper. She handed it to Jack with a grin. "This is for you." Jack stared at the box, surprised. "What's this for?" "Just because," Emily said, her voice filled with the kind of certainty only a child could have. "Open it." Jack carefully unwrapped the box, revealing a framed drawing. It was a picture of him standing with the Harpers in front of their home, a bright sun shining down and the words, "Our family," scrawled in Emily's neat handwriting. He stared at the drawing for a long moment, his chest tight with emotion. "Emily, this is," he trailed off, unable to find the words. "Do you like it?" she asked, her voice tentative. Jack looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I love it," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you." Emily beamed, climbing onto his lap to give him a hug. Jack held her close, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. He glanced at Tom and Hannah, who watched the scene with quiet smiles. As the evening wore on, Jack found himself lingering long after Emily had gone to bed. He sat with Tom and Hannah by the fire, the three of them talking about everything and nothing. It was easy, comfortable, the kind of companionship Jack had forgotten he could have. When it was finally time to leave, Hannah walked Jack to the door. The night was still and cold, the snow glinting under the light of the porch. "Thank you for staying," Hannah said. It means a lot to Emily. To all of us. Jack nodded, his breath visible in the cold air. I wouldn't have missed it. As he stepped outside, Hannah called after him. Jack. He turned, his hand on the railing. Yeah. You're part of this family, she said, her voice steady. Don't ever forget that. Jack nodded, his chest tight with emotion. I won't. As he walked back to his cabin, the crisp air filling his lungs, Jack felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He had spent so long running from connection, from the pain of losing the people he loved. But now, he realized, he wasn't just running anymore. He was moving forward, toward something new, something whole. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he had a future. One built not on grief, but on love, hope, and the family he had found in the most unexpected of places. And that, he thought, was the greatest gift of all.